What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we're checking out the 5 best games from rounds number 2 and 3 of the 2024 World Rapid Chess Championship in Astana, Kazakhstan. Now, this tournament is epic. It features some of the biggest names in chess, including, of course, Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann himself. Now, of course, I'm covering the 5 best games from rounds number 2 and 3 of this tournament, and here's a quick breakdown of what you're going to see in this video. So the first 3 games are wild. We got Hans Niemann in game number 1, then Ding Liren in game number 2, and then Richard Rapport in game number 3. Those games are epic, but the 4th and 5th game, oh my goodness. Game number 4 has Magnus Carlsen facing off as black against the incredibly aggressive player Arjun Erigaisi. Now, Arjun is one of the top Indian prodigies right now, and Magnus Carlsen described this guy as a madman who wants to kill you over the board every single game. And game 5, that might be the best one of all. It is Ding Liren, the current defending world champion, facing off against Hans Niemann. And oh my goodness, that 5th game, oh, you gotta see it. Okay, that's plenty of hype. Now, for the first game, we have Hans Niemann as black facing off against a lower-rated grandmaster named Bilguun. Now, of course, Hans is the clear favorite in this game, so he's going all out playing for a win as black, which is going to make this very entertaining for us. Now, in the game, Sumia opens 1e4, and Hans Niemann, typically when he's playing for a win as black against 1e4, he goes for the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, and that is exactly what we see today. That is one of the sharpest responses to 1e4. Of course, the Najdorf starts with 1c5, the Sicilian, and then from there as black, you go d6, you take on d4, then you go knight f6, and finally a6. This is also my favorite way to respond to 1e4. It is just an insanely sharp opening as black. Now, of course, from here, white has like 15 different ideas against the Najdorf that he can play. The main line, of course, is the English attack with bishop e3 or f3. However, there are a ton of other aggressive options as well. Bishop g5 is still very popular. h3 is quite good. Magnus quite likes rook g1. And there are just a ton of sidelines. Now, in the game today, Sumia goes for a line that I have not seen in a very long time. That is the move f4. Now, if you're a beginner, you may never have seen this move f4 against the Najdorf. It is pretty rare. However, it is a reasonably logical idea. I mean, in the open Sicilian, white often goes f4 trying to gain space in the center and on the king side. So this move certainly makes a lot of sense at first glance. Now, here black has a variety of options that he can respond with. e6 and e5 are both pretty popular, and Hans Niemann goes for the typical Najdorf move with e5, gaining space in the middle of the board. Now from here, both sides follow the absolute main line of this variation. White retreats the knight to f3, getting it behind the pawn. That is part of the idea of going f4 right away. That way, if black responds with e5, you can retreat the knight back to f3 behind the pawn. Now from here, there is a lot of theory in this variation, and Hans Niemann and Sumia play the main line. That is starting with queen c7 for black. White gains space on the queen side with a4. The idea behind this is stopping the idea of b5 from black, and b5 is a key resource in this line, so a4 makes a lot of sense. And of course, white's typically gonna castle on the king side here with like bishop d3 and short castles, so gaining space with a4 is not a problem. Now from here, Hans Niemann, bishop e7, white brings the bishop to d3. That is the main square for the bishop in this line with f4. And here Hans Niemann, knight b to d7. Now, typically in the Najdorf, you are going to want to get that bishop to the e6 square before going knight b to d7. That way your bishop is not trapped on c8. However, this variation is a little bit different. If Hans Niemann were to go bishop e6 right away here, white has this idea of f5 right away, hitting the bishop and gaining space on the king side with tempo. So, for example, if Hans Niemann were to go bishop e6, then immediately f5 is a good move. Black would have to retreat the bishop, then white can go something like g4, immediately starting an attack. So bishop e6, not the best idea here right away. So Hans Niemann's move of knight b to d7, very, very logical. Now from here, both sides castles. White goes king h1, getting his king off this open diagonal here. Of course, that is one of the weaknesses of the move f4. The king is now exposed. So king h1, very logical waiting move, getting the king to safety. Now Hans Niemann, knight to c5, putting pressure on the pawn on e4 and that bishop on d3. And of course, this knight move does open up the way for the bishop to go to d7 or e6 in the future. And again, so far, most of this is all well-known theory. Now, white, from here, he starts his attack. Queen e1, very good multi-purpose move. The queen is now eyeing the g3 and the h4 squares. And here, so far, both players have played all the best moves, but on this position, on move 12, Hans Niemann, he makes a very significant mistake. He plays the move bishop to e6. Now, as we've talked about, e6 is typically the best square for the bishop in the Najdorf. However, in this position, it is not the best square. The problem in this line is white has the resource f5 immediately hitting the bishop. Then the bishop has to retreat, and then white can continue the attack with the move g4. Now, this is just incredibly dangerous. I mean, already white is threatening g5, perhaps f6 next, just launching those kingside pawns down the board. And it may look like white is sacrificing a pawn, but black cannot take the pawn on g4. If black were to take it, then white has the resource knight to d5. Of course, the knight on f6 was covering the d5 square, but as soon as that knight moves, the knight immediately comes into d5. And from here, white's attack is just raging. Black has to retreat the queen, then white goes rook g1, lining up the rook on the open g-file. I mean, this is just horrible for black. You don't want this. So overall, this move bishop e6 from Hans Niemann, that was a critical mistake. However, white misses the idea of f5 here. I'm not really sure why. Now, instead of f5 in this position, white goes for the other idea of knight to h4. Now, the idea behind this move is the knight is eyeing the f5 square, and now that the bishop has already gone to e6, knight f5 is a dangerous idea, because let's say black wastes a move, king h8. Now, if white goes knight f5, typically you want to take that knight on f5 with the bishop. However, now the bishop has already gone to e6, and it wastes a tempo going bishop e6, then bishop takes f5. So overall, knight h4, not a terrible idea, but again, f5 would have been a better idea immediately. Now, here on move 13, Hans Niemann has a few different ideas. The computer really likes the idea of b5, sacrificing a pawn on the queen side to try and get active play, or instead of that, taking on d3 and only then b7 to b5. However, Hans Niemann, he is a very aggressive player. He does not like to sit back and wait, and in this position, he lashes out with the very provocative move d5. Now, the idea of d6 to d5 is a very common resource in the Najdorf. It is black's main pawn break. However, here in this position, there is just so much tension between these pawns, and that was not the best idea. And from here, white responds correctly. He takes on e5 with the f-pawn. Black responds knight f takes e4, and now knight to f5 from white. We're seeing white's idea, and if black were to take that knight on f5, white can recapture with the rook, not damaging his pawn structure. So now that knight on f5 is an absolute monster. Garry Kasparov once said a knight on f5 is worth at least a pawn, meaning instead of being worth 3 pawns, that knight is probably worth more like 4 pawns right now in this position. Okay, now from here, Hans Niemann, he gets rid of that knight on c3. Knight takes, queen takes, then he goes rook a to c8, lining up the rook with the queen. And from here, overall, we have a relatively level position. White, of course, has the weak pawn on e5. Black, the relatively weak isolated pawn on d5. And while, yes, white does technically have some attacking chances on the king side, black has a decent amount of counterplay on the queen side, especially with this open c-file. And overall, the game is about level. So Hans Niemann pretty much getting what he wanted in this game, a level but very complicated position where hopefully he can outplay his lower rated opponent. Now from here, white goes bishop e3, and there are a bunch of exchanges for both sides. Black takes on d3. Now the queens come flying off the board. Now knight takes e7, rook takes, and finally c takes d3. So we transformed from that middle game to this relatively level endgame. And now typically I don't cover endgames in too much detail on this channel, but this endgame was wild. It was a back and forth game, and oh my goodness, Hans Niemann, I don't want to give it away, but all right, diving right in. Now from here, both sides start their plans. Hans Niemann wants to take control of the c-file with his rooks, while white, on the other hand, tries to blockade it with the move bishop c5, then d4. So real fast, Hans Niemann getting his rooks over there, and white trying to blockade. Now, you may be wondering, why the heck did Hans Niemann put his other rook on c7 as well? I mean, isn't this bishop perfectly defended on the c5 square? Now, that is what I thought, but Hans Niemann, he lashes out with the rook sacrifice. Rook takes c5, Oh my goodness, Hans Niemann, what the heck are you doing? I mean, he gave up his rook for a pawn and a bishop. That is a bad trade. I mean, yes, technically he has that protected pass pawn on d5, but that is not enough. The bishop is passive. He only has one rook. Hans Niemann, what the heck are you doing? Okay, Hans, he is no dummy. Clearly, he must have some idea in mind. Perhaps he wants to outplay his opponent in an imbalanced endgame. I don't know. Okay, white, rook f to c1. Great move. Now here, Hans Niemann, he does not want to trade rooks. When you have one rook versus your opponent's two, it is always a good idea to keep your one rook on the board. Hans Niemann does that with the move rook to b5. Now, white defends rook c2. That is a little bit passive. There was a better idea. The pawn sacrifice b4 in this position, and if Hans Niemann took, then white goes rook b1, and white is going to win back that pawn on b7. It's a little complicated, not going to cover it here, but instead, rook c2 on the board. Again, a little bit passive from white. I mean, typically in the endgame with rooks, you want to keep your rooks as active as humanly possible. That is a huge priority. Now, Hans, bishop f5, hitting the rook d2 from white, and king f8. Finally, there are no back rank mate threats from white. And from here, Hans Niemann trying to bring his king into the middle of the board. So far, Hans is holding relatively well, but white still looks a little better to me. Now, white, rook c5. This move seemingly sacrifices a pawn. If Hans wanted to, he could go rook takes, b takes, then king takes, and suddenly he wins yet another pawn, but Hans Niemann does not go for that. Instead, he plays the kind of weird-looking move, bishop to c6. What the heck, Hans? Now your rook is kind of trapped on b5? Hans Niemann's moves in this game, I just do not understand them. Okay, rook takes, bishop takes played in the game, and now we have a very similar position as if Hans took on c5, except now he has not won the e5 pawn immediately. And here, white, rook f2. If Hans Niemann takes on e5, white's going to capture on f7. And from here, both sides start shuffling their pieces a little bit. Nothing much really happens in the game. Yes, Hans Niemann goes d4, but it's not too much. And finally, in this position, Hans Niemann finally does win that pawn on e4. It looks like he's starting to slowly outplay his opponent. However, white is still a little bit better here, and he finds the critical idea, b5, the temporary pawn sacrifice. Of course, the idea behind this move, if black is to take on b5, white responds rook b3, winning that pawn on b5 and putting pressure on b7, so that would be very, very good for white. Obviously, Hans Niemann does not do that. He goes bishop c2. Now, b takes, and king e1. And here, white is still much better. He might even be winning with correct play in this position. Of course, that rook is just so much stronger than the bishop. So again, why did Hans Niemann go for this endgame? I don't know, but let's see what happens here. Hans Niemann, he starts to fight back. He brings his pawn to f4. Is he going to push his pawns down the board? Okay, g3 from white. Hans does not trade f3. Oh my goodness, Hans. Is he gonna go all the way? Okay, Hans Niemann, g5. Oh my goodness. Hans Niemann bringing the king in the board. Bishop b5. And here, white, he's technically a little bit worse, but he can still force a draw with the very easy move rook to e6. And now the king is forced to go back to either d5 or f5. However, here on move 51, his opponent doesn't find it. He goes h3. And the problem with this move is after bishop c4, the bishop covers the e6 square, and it's no longer possible to drive back the king. Oh my goodness, Hans Niemann is winning. What? Okay, king e1 from white, king e3, the king moves forward. Again, the rook cannot challenge the king. Oh no, rook f5, but black just continues to press forward. He goes d3, and suddenly there is nothing white can do to stop the pawn from promoting. And in this position on move 55, Sumia Bilguun resigns to Hans Niemann. Oh my goodness, Hans trading into a worse endgame for absolutely no reason and then outplaying his opponent. Hans, you're my favorite player, but you are giving me a heart attack in this video. Okay, if you thought that last game by Hans Niemann was wild, wait until you see this one featuring Ding Liren, the defending world champion and the #1 rated player out of China. Now, Ding Liren lately has not been playing the best chess ever. However, he is starting to find his form, and thank goodness he is defending his world championship title this year in November, and he is going to need all the chess strength he has to face off against Gukesh, one of the rising Indian prodigies. So in this game, Ding Liren is clearly the favorite against Denis Makhnev. Denis is still a very strong grandmaster, but clearly not on Ding Liren's level. And this game, oh my goodness, there is a knight sacrifice on move 12 that is going to blow your mind. Yes, it is a theoretical knight sacrifice, meaning it is very well known amongst the top grandmasters, but the complications after this knight sack are just insane. Okay, in the game, we get a semi-Slav defense. White opens 1d4, Ding d5, and we have the standard semi-Slav move order c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and then e6, the defining move of the semi-Slav. Now, this is one of the strongest openings against 1d4. It is very, very hard to prove an advantage here, but of course, white has some different attempts here. The two main moves are bishop g5 and e3. Of course, the advantage of bishop g5 is you do get that bishop outside the pawn chain before going e3. However, you do risk sacrificing the pawn on c4 when you do that. And as fate would have it, that is what we have on the board. Bishop g5 may be the strongest and definitely the most theoretical move in this position. Now, from here, Ding Liren has a wide variety of options. There is the ultra-sharp Botvinnik variation. That has definitely fallen out of favor, although it is technically playable. And the more solid ideas here are knight d7, the Cambridge Springs, and bishop e7, sort of a hybrid between the Queen's Gambit Declined and the semi-Slav. However, Ding Liren is in a fighting mood, and he goes for the older idea of h6. White retreats the bishop, bishop h4, and now instead of the more common move, bishop e7, Ding Liren goes for the anti-Moscow gambit with d takes c4. Oh boy, we are in for a fight. Here, the main line goes e4, white's threatening bishop takes c4, and of course, white also threatens e5, hitting the knight that is currently pinned on f6, so black has to deal with that. He goes g5, hitting the bishop, bishop g3, and then b5, defending the pawn. Okay, this is the real starting position of the anti-Moscow gambit. This is easily one of the most complicated positions in all of chess. Here, black is up a pawn. Of course, he won that pawn on c4. However, his pawns all over the board are very far advanced. They're very vulnerable, and white is going to have tremendous attacking chances in return for the sacrifice pawn. Now from here, white has a variety of options. The two main ideas are bishop e2 and castles, or going for an early h2, h4 in some move order. So here, white, he goes for the first option, bishop e2. White's intending short castling, and now black plays the main line in response. That is bishop b7, followed by knight b to d7. So bishop b7, castles, knight b to d7, and here white has a choice, and he does jump forward with the knight to knight e5. So far, everything has been ultra standard. White has a variety of threats here. He might want to take on d7 and bring his bishop to e5. He might want to go h4. Maybe he's going to go b3, breaking on the queen side. So overall, variety of threats. And now from here, the main move and the strongest move according to theory is the move h5. However, Ding Liren, he doesn't play h5. Instead, he goes bishop to g7. Now, this move looks very logical. Getting the bishop to g7. It's a very good square for the bishop. He's going to go castles next. Now, personally, I am not a big fan of this move, bishop g7 from Ding Liren. I don't want to sound like I know more than Ding. However, this move invites an insane knight sacrifice on the f7 square if white wants it. And it turns out that is exactly what happens in this game. Here, Dennis Makhnev, he goes for it with knight takes f7, and yes, that is just a clean sacrifice of the knight. He's only getting a pawn. White's idea here is he's going to get long-term attacking chances in return for the knight. And of course, white was already down one pawn, that pawn on c4, so white is literally down an entire knight in this position. Oh my goodness. Okay, now, white's main idea here is e5. The other idea that looks pretty logical is f4. However, it doesn't work here. I'm not going to go into too much detail. e5 is the strongest and the best move. Now, Ding has a choice. He can either go knight d5 or give back the knight with the move rook to f8. For example, if he went rook f8, the main line goes e takes, then knight takes, and suddenly white wins back the knight. However, black is going to bring his king to the g8 square, and the game is still roughly level. Instead of that, Ding Liren, in an all-out fighting move, he keeps the knight, knight d5. Oh my goodness, this game is just too much. Okay, white, knight e4, bringing the knight to the central square. Black, king e7, getting the king off the open f-file. And of course, white was threatening knight d6, hitting the king and the bishop on b7, so king e7 absolutely mandatory there. Now, knight d6 from white, good move, attacking the bishop on b7, and Ding Liren, queen b6, both defending the bishop and getting the queen to a very active square. Now, white, a4, maybe threatening to open up the a-file and activating the rook on a1. Very solid move, and here Ding Liren makes probably his first mistake of the game. He plays a very logical looking move, a6. However, this is not the best idea. Instead, the right idea here is rook a to f8. The idea is the king might be safe on the queen side. However, you want the rook over to the king side before you start to move the king over here to either c8 or c7. So instead of that, a6 on the board for black, defending. And here, white has to find the right way to continue the attack. Now, the computer really likes the idea of bishop to g4 here. The idea is the bishop hits the e6 square, and then from there, white's going to go queen c2, threatening queen g6, putting more pressure on g7 and e6. So that is the best development of the pieces, and white, he almost gets it right. He's so close. Instead of bishop g4, he goes bishop f3. Now, the idea behind this move is, of course, bishop takes d5. Not a bad idea. That is very common in the anti-Moscow gambit. However, of course, g4 was the best square for the bishop. Now, Ding Liren, he finds a good move, but he plays it at the wrong time. Here, he goes rook a to f8. Now, we just talked about that idea, getting the rook over to the f-file before bringing the king over to the queen side. Now, decent idea. However, here, the timing is just bad. I hate to say it. Instead of that, the right move was c5, breaking on the queen side and getting rid of the double pawns. So, for example, from here, c5, best move. If white takes, black's going to go knight takes c5, and suddenly black is looking pretty good in this position. The knight on d5, perfectly defended by the pawn and the bishop, and black's sitting pretty. So instead of that, rook a to f8 on the board here, and now white goes for his idea. Bishop takes d5, c takes, then he opens up the a file. A takes b5, a takes b5. Okay, this is a great time to slow down and talk strategy. Now, white is still down a minor piece here. White has the knight and the bishop, while black has the bishop pair and the knight. So clearly, white is still down material. However, just look at this bishop on b7. It has literally nothing that it can do because these pawns on b5, c4, d5, and e6 completely lock it in. I mean, it literally cannot go anywhere. And meanwhile, the knight on d7 not really doing a whole lot, again trapped in, and the bishop on g7 hitting granite. So really, the star piece of this game is that knight on d6, and despite being down a whole minor piece, white is still fighting for an advantage here. Okay, now white, he has a variety of attacking ideas here, or perhaps queen c2 threatening queen g6 was an idea. Maybe he wants to get something going on the a file here, but instead of all that, white goes for the move h4. Now, this is a very, very common idea in the anti-Moscow gambit. You're opening up the h file, trying to weaken black's pawn structure on the king side. However, here, white doesn't have a rook on h1, and black's rook's on the king side. I mean, black stands to benefit more than white from the move h4. So overall, not a good idea. Now here, Ding Liren, rook h to g8, defending the g5 pawn in advance. Now white takes on g5, h takes, and queen to d2, simply threatening that pawn on the g5 square. However, beyond that, white also has the threat of queen to b4, and we may see that next. So very good multi-purpose idea from white. Now here, Ding Liren, this is a very critical position in this game. He has to find the key resource, knight b8, intending knight c6 next. Now this move, you have to play it right now because white wants to go queen b4 next. Now real fast, here's how it plays out. Knight b8. If white goes queen b4, then you are just in time with the move knight to c6, and suddenly the queen has to go somewhere else. Of course, white here was threatening some sort of x-ray attack on the king, perhaps knight to c8, hitting the king and hitting the queen. However, with the knight on c6 already, the queen is threatened, and that is not an option for white. And here, real fast, of course, in this position here, white was not really threatening queen takes g5. If white takes queen takes g5, it is hitting the king with check. However, after simply king to d7, black actually benefits more than white from that open g-file, and white's king is going to be in a lot of danger on the king side as the game progresses. Okay, of course, none of that happened in the game. Knight b8 was the best move. It was not played, though. Instead, Ding Liren, bishop h6, defending the pawn. However, this move is slow. The bishop is going to be very passive on h6. The pawn did not need to be defended. And now white hits queen b4 before black can go knight b8 to c6. And white is threatening all sorts of discovered attacks on the king. For example, knight b8, forking the king and the queen. And oh my goodness, this is going to be too much. Okay, Ding Liren, king to d8, getting the king out of the x-ray attack, the good idea. Now white increasing the pressure on the a file, rook a5, rook f to a1, and finally Ding Liren finds the move knight to b8 just in time. Of course, white managed to win the pawn on b5, but black hanging in there so far. Now from here, both sides managed to bring the queens off the board, and we enter into a very complicated endgame style position. And here, technically, material is equal. White has a rook and an extra pawn versus black's 2 minor pieces. However, the computer seems to think Ding Liren has the better chances. So Ding Liren defending in this game and getting rewarded with the better endgame in the end. Now from here, we have a bunch more exchanges. White takes the minor piece on a6, winning 2 minor pieces for the rook. However, Ding Liren has pressure on that pawn on the b2 square. So white defending, rook a2, but now Ding Liren g4, the positional pawn sacrifice. The idea is he wants to open up that diagonal for the bishop so we can put pressure on the b2 square. And if b2 falls, that passed pawn on c4 is going to be a monster. And that is what happens here. F takes bishop F, bishop C1. And now here, white, he has to think about how to get counterplay against the black king. The best move is simply rook to A7. And then from there, after the king moves, you're going to go rook A6, putting pressure on that E6 pawn. Again, white has to counterattack here. The most important thing in an endgame with rooks is keeping your rook as active as possible. But instead of that, he keeps it passive on the A2 square. He goes king F2, but now the pawn on b2 falls anyway. And oh my goodness, that passed pawn on the c4 square. It's just too much. White, king e3, another mistake. But now rook b3 from black, king f4. He went king f4. That, oh my goodness, there's a mating threat. Bishop c1 from Ding Liren. And believe it or not, the only way to delay checkmate is the move rook d2. And in this position, Dennis Makhnev, Ding Liren's opponent, he resigns. Of course, rook d2, then bishop takes d2, and it is checkmate. Every single square for the white king is covered. Oh my goodness, what a game from the defending world champion. Ding Liren swatting off that knight sacrifice like it was nothing and winning the game in the endgame. Wow, simply incredible stuff by the world champion. All right, now we're diving into our third game. This is going to be a short but sweet game with Richard Rapport. He is one of the most creative grandmasters in the world. And in this game, he's playing as white against the British grandmaster Nigel Short. Now, Richard Rapport, this guy gives me a heart attack when I watch his games. I'm rated about 2,000 online, and I'm trying to improve. And I'm trying to learn like classical chess principles, you know, normal development, normal looking moves. And then when I watch Richard Rapport's games, my head explodes. I have a heart attack. I just don't understand what the heck he's doing in half of his games. So diving in, Richard Rapport is white, opens 1 e4. We get e4, e5 on the board. And from there, Richard goes for a Roy Lopez. Okay, so far so good. a6, bishop a4, knight f6. And now a series of very weird moves from Richard Rapport. First of all, knight c3. Now this move is not that weird, but typically white's going to go either d3 or castles here. Okay, fair enough. Knight c3, defending the pawn, not a bad move. Now bishop b7, and now Richard takes on c6, the delayed exchange variation. Okay, this is not super dangerous, but let's see what Richard has in mind. D takes, and now queen e2. Richard, come on. You're making my life hard here. I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about. I'm supposed to know why you're doing what you're doing. How do I explain this to beginners? Okay, bishop g4 from Nigel Short. Very interesting idea. White does have the idea of h3 here. However, if white does that, as Richard did in the game, then after h3, bishop takes, queen takes. The queen is now wasted a tempo going to e2, then f3. So not a bad idea from Nigel Short, getting rid of the bishop with a gain of tempo on the queen. And now Nigel, he has this idea of castling queenside here. Very interesting. So queen d6, d3 from Richard, and opposite sides castling on the board. Wow. Okay. Now, Richard, more weirdness from this guy. Knight d1. His idea is he wants to reroute the knight to the f5 square. Okay, Nigel, queen e6 prophylaxis against the idea of knight e3 to knight f5 from white. Now, bishop d2, potentially going bishop c3 next, king b8 from black, and knight e3. Okay, so far so good, and here is where Richard Rapport launches a queenside attack with his A and his B pawns. Here we go. a4, then b4. Oh boy, both sides attacking all out with their pawns. Now, Nigel, knight d7, rerouting the knight, and also freeing up f7 to f5 ideas. Now, Richard castles, rook hf8, clearly eyeing the f5 move, and here Richard gets the first breakthrough on the queen side with the move b5. Of course, Richard making full use of those pawn hooks on the a6 and c6 squares. Now, this is the first critical position of the game. Here, black has to find the right response. Do you take on b5 with one of those pawns? Or do you simply ignore the threat and just get on with your own attack? Well, it turns out the latter option was the right idea. The key move here is the idea f5 breaking on the king side. So from here, white's going to have to take on f5. Black takes back, and it turns out black can actually ignore the threat on the pawns. For example, if white takes b takes a6, black can ignore the pawn there, just push f4 and continue attacking on the king side. So overall, f5 would have been the key idea in this position, but instead of that, Nigel Short, he ends up taking on b5, and this is not good, to say the least. All right, white takes back, black takes. Technically, this was a pawn sacrifice from Richard Rapport. However, Richard has an incredibly dangerous idea. Knight d5. Okay, this is if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right here and try to figure out what white's threat is in this position. I mean, this one's pretty easy. I'm going to say you only deserve one happy meal if you can find this move. Even if you're a beginner, this should be pretty easy to find. Now, of course, the idea here is rook a8 check, forcing the king to the a8 square. Then you go knight c7, forking the king on a8 and the queen. So what is black supposed to do here? Well, the best move is bishop d6, simply defending that c7 pawn. That way, if white went rook a8, king a8, suddenly c7 is defended by the bishop. However, here, Nigel Short, I don't know what happened. He missed the idea. He went bishop c5. Oh my goodness. Richard Rapport, he does not miss the opportunity. Rook a8 on the board. Then after king takes, the knight fork, the knight hitting the queen and the king. Oh, ho, ho, ho. King b8, knight takes, f takes, and Nigel Short lost his queen. Okay, technically Nigel Short got a rook and the knight for the queen. Now that is not the end of the world in itself, but looking beyond that, Nigel's pawn structure completely ruined all over the board. These are just awful pawns. And beyond that, look at his king. His king's so vulnerable. White's queen way better than black's minor piece and rook. And from here, it's not too hard, but Nigel Short, he makes things go from bad to worse with the move rook f6. Richard Rapport responds bishop g5, pinning the rooks. I don't know if Nigel was just drunk at the board or trying to lose faster. I mean, no disrespect, incredible player, a chess legend, but still, rook f6. Nigel, come on, man. And from here, the rest of the game was just Richard Rapport absolutely cleaning up. And after f4, Nigel says, I have had enough. He resigns to Richard Rapport. Richard with the really weird Roy Lopez that I barely understand, but making it look easy in this game. Wow, what a performance. All right, diving into game number 4, we have Arjun Erigaisi, the Indian prodigy, versus Magnus Carlsen, the undisputed greatest chess player in the world. This matchup is insane. I mean, if you know anything about Arjun Erigaisi, this guy is a I mean, in real life, his personality is so calm, so relaxed, so chill, but over the board, this guy is an absolute madman. He wants to destroy his opponent no matter who it is every single game. I mean, most players against Magnus Carlsen would be saying, okay, how can I get a relatively calm position where I can get a draw without too much trouble? But no, Arjun, he just goes for it. Doesn't matter who he's playing. And in case you're wondering, yes, I did just change my shirt, just took a shower, got back from the gym. You know, I got to maintain my status as the most jacked chess YouTuber in the world. I think I just dethroned Gotham Chess, although he is looking pretty big these days, so you know how it is. Now, in the game, Arjun Erigaisi, he opens 1e4, and real fast, we get a Roy Lopez on the board with knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. Now, Magnus, he plays just about everything in the Roy Lopez as black. Typically, his main weapon has been the martial attack, starting with move a6. However, today, he did not go for that. Instead, he plays the Berlin defense with the move knight f6. Now, typically, Magnus avoids the Berlin these days, as it is so theoretical, and it is so easy for white to force a draw if he wants it, but Arjun, thankfully, he does not go for a draw today. Instead, he plays the more combative move d3. Now, from here, Magnus, typically the main move here for black is, of course, bishop c5, but he avoids that today, plays the move d6. Now, d6 is playable. It's a little bit passive. That bishop, of course, is going to be stuck inside the pawn chain on f8. However, it's not a bad idea. Now, from here, castles, bishop e7, and the main idea for white here is the move c3, playing in typical Roy Lopez or Italian game style. I mean, from there, white's going to go rook e1, knight d2 to f1 to g3, play for d4, and so on. But instead of all that, today, Arjun Erigaisi throws a curveball. But instead of all that, here on move 6, Arjun, he breaks in the center immediately with the move d4. Now, obviously, this move has a drawback. Here, white went d3 and then d4, so achieving the d4 break in 2 moves instead of 1. So this does count as a loss of a tempo. However, black playing this setup with d6 and bishop e7, that is a little more passive, meaning white can sort of afford to do this. Now, from here, we get a very original position. Magnus, he does not take on d4, instead immediately castling, and Arjun pushes d5. Now, from here, we get a quick tactical skirmish. Black going a6, Arjun retreating the bishop to e2. Now, knight b8, bishop d3, and knight b to d7. So from here, we get that classical King's Indian pawn structure in the middle of the board. White, of course, having those pawns on d5 and e4, black on d6 and e5. And what that means is white is going to gain space on the queen side. He's going to try to go c4, b4, and probably c5 at some point. Meanwhile, black, on the other hand, is going to try to bring this knight away from the f6 square, perhaps knight h5 or knight e8, and then go for the f5 break. So both sides playing on opposite sides of the board. White going for queen side pawn breaks, or black going for king side pawn breaks. So this is going to be a very, very tense middle game position. Now white starts c4, gaining space on the queen side. Black knight c5, targeting that bishop. Now typically you do not want to allow black to win one of your bishops this early in the game. However, this bishop is not super important for white's position. Of course, he has those pawns on light squares. So this bishop is a little bit less necessary for white's position, so he just allows black to take it. Knight c3, knight takes, queen takes. Now technically black has the bishop pair, but again, it's not that big of a deal in this position. Okay, from here, Magnus, he immediately starts with that plan of getting f5 on the board. So he goes knight e8, then after a4 from white, f5, breaking on the king side. Now from here, Arjun, in my opinion, at least based on my understanding, he should really think about getting c5 on the board as fast as he can. But instead, he has other ideas in mind, and instead he gains space on the queen side with the move a5. Now this is a typical idea in the King's Indian in the Mar del Plata variation, where black goes 7, knight c6, and we get this kind of pawn structure in the middle of the board. I feel like he's just a little bit faster than he typically is in the King's Indian, and I feel like this is a little bit too slow for white. I mean, who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. If I am wrong, let me know in the comments section below and let me know what the real strategy is here, but I still think c5 a little faster might have been the right move for white. Now from here, black has a couple of options. Does Magnus want to release the tension in the center with the move f takes e4, or does he want to go for broke on the king side with the move f4? Now f4 would have been absolutely wild if Magnus had played this. Then the plan is the King's Indian-style attack with the move g7 to g5, then g4, maybe even g3. And the idea is basically to checkmate white as quickly as humanly possible. Now, that would have been insane, but instead, Magnus going for a somewhat simpler option. F takes e4. The computer seems to think this is much weaker than the move f4, just a move earlier, so this being a little bit of an error by Magnus. Now, from here, knight takes e4, and in this position, a lot of plans are still the same. Magnus is going to attack on the king side, white on the queen side. And beyond that, this e4 square might be the most important square in the entire position. White's plan is to bolster that square as much as humanly possible. Okay, from here, bishop f5, challenging that e4 square from white. White, bishop e3, knight f6, and then knight f to d2. So very solid development from white. Of course, getting the bishop to the e3 square and only then going knight d2 once the bishop's already out in front of the knight. So very solid play by Arjun, maintaining very good control of e4. Now Magnus, queen e8, bringing the queen over to the king side. Solid idea. And here Arjun trades on f6, then brings the other knight back to the e4 square. So Arjun doing a very good job of maintaining control over e4 so far. Now Magnus, rook f8, retreating the rook, and f3 from Arjun. Again, just supporting e4 with everything he's got. Now from here, Arjun seems to have really stabilized the position, and now his plan is going to be b4 and then either c5 or b5, trying to gain more space on the queen side where he does have a space advantage already. Now Magnus, queen g6, b4 from Arjun, definitely the right idea. And now, what the heck is Magnus going to do? I mean, white's plan is very, very obvious. Just push through, b5, c5, one of those moves. Start trading pawns on the queen side. Start targeting black's weak pawns. Double up on the c-file. Rook c1, rook c2, rook c1. But Magnus, what is he going to do here? How is he going to attack when white is so solid on the king side? Well, fortunately for us, Magnus Carlsen has a plan. He is a man with a plan. And he starts by launching the h-pawn down the board, Alpha Zero style, with the move h5. Now, if you're not familiar with the term Alpha Zero is a computer program developed by Google around 2017. And at the time, it was the strongest chess program in the world, stronger than Stockfish. It actually beat Stockfish in a match. And it popularized this idea of attacking with h5 to h4 to h3 in almost any position as white or as black. Of course, when you're white, you push the h2 pawn down the board. And yes, this strategy did exist before Alpha Zero, especially when black or white has the pawn on g3 or g6 and there's already a hook. However, Alpha Zero really showed just how strong this strategy could be in almost any position. Okay, now from here, both sides are pretty much all in with their plans. Arjun b5, Magnus h4. Magnus is going for it, but so is Arjun. b6, trying to create some weaknesses on the queen side. Magnus defends. C takes, bishop takes. Now Magnus, rook a c8, defending on the c-file. White goes c5, trying to blow open the queen side. Of course, if Magnus takes the pawn on c5, then there is this insane idea of d6 cutting off the bishop, and Arjun will have the initiative. So of course, Magnus does not oblige with that. Instead, he goes full Alpha Zero with the move h3. Now this is the full idea of Alpha Zero that he popularized here. White has to go g3 trying to defend. But now this h3 pawn is going to be an absolute menace for the rest of the game. There are so many different ideas. First of all, if black ever gets that queen down to the g2 square, that is going to be checkmate. However, beyond that, there are some other ideas. There are also going to be back rank mate threats, getting the king, and even in an endgame, we'll see this pawn on h3. If, for example, the h2 pawn ever disappears from the board, that pawn on h3 is going to be so close to promoting. So Magnus, he is seeing into the future. He knows no matter what happens in this game, having that pawn on h3 is going to be a huge asset. All right, now from here, Magnus, he decides it is time to trade into an endgame. He trades on e4, gets rid of the queens, then takes on c5. Of course, that d6 threat, no longer something he has to worry about. And Arjun trades a pair of rooks. Rook takes, then king f2, getting his king into the game. Now, this endgame is ultra complicated. However, there's a very, very instructive part of it coming up real fast. Just hang in with me here. So Magnus starts pushing the pawn. Arjun bringing his king to the center. And now Arjun Arjun makes a big mistake with the move rook to b1. This move is just incredibly passive. Instead of that, rook f1, checking the king, perhaps going to f5 next, targeting this pawn. That would have been the right strategy. Whenever you have rooks in an endgame, it is critical to keep them as active as possible. You always want your rook attacking something instead of defending. So rook b1 on the board, major mistake. Magnus capitalized with a strong idea c3, and from here both the bishops and the rooks end up coming off the board, and Magnus understanding even if this pawn on c2 is lost, it doesn't matter. This pawn on b6 from white is going to fall, and then he is simply going to have a winning king and pawn endgame. So real fast, here's the idea. Magnus Carlsen, he cuts off the king, he wins the pawn on the b6 square. Now these pawns on b7 and a6 are probably going to decide the game. However, white does have this passed pawn on the d5 square. Now Magnus has to be super careful about not getting too far away from that passed pawn. Of course, if you know anything about king and pawn endgames, you know about the rule of the square. Now this pawn is only 3 squares away from promoting to a queen, and the rule of the square means if you draw a square with the pawn like this, then the king has to be inside of this square at all times in order to be able to catch up to the pawn if it ever advances to the d6 square. So if the king ever crosses the 5th rank into the 4th rank, that pawn is going to be too far away. It's going to automatically promote. So let's watch as Magnus Carlsen manages to push these pawns down the board without going outside of this little square here. So as you'll see, Magnus just slowly but surely pushing the pawns down the board. And very importantly, real fast, in this kind of position, white can never ever take this pawn on b6, because as soon as the king does that, let's say Magnus goes here, white takes the pawn, then this pawn immediately pushes down, and it is simply impossible for the king to ever catch up to the pawn like that. So going back to this position here with the 2 pawns and the king, these 2 pawns are always protected, so Magnus Carlsen's goal is to slowly push these pawns down the board while guarding this pawn. So here's that strategy in action. Magnus just slowly pushing, and every time the king comes back, he pushes his pawns just a little bit further, and this entire time, of course, not leaving that square of the white pawn on d5. Now he keeps pushing the pawns, keeps pushing, and in this position, there's no way to push the pawns further without committing his king, and he finally goes all in with the move king c4. Now, of course, he is outside of the square of the pawn, and that means after the move d6 from white, that pawn can never be caught. It is just faster to the d8 square. So what is Magnus going to do? King d3, d7. Now he queens the 1 pawn. Then he launches forward with the king here. And in this position, Arjun Erigaisi resigns on the spot. Here's why. After he promotes to a queen, Magnus goes b2 check. Then king a2, b1 promoted to a queen. Then king a3. And then finally queen b3 check. Wow, so when we go all the way back to this position here on move 54, after king c4, he removes himself from the square of the pawn. He calculated literally everything all the way to this checkmate on move 60. Wow, what a game by Magnus Carlsen, demonstrating his endgame technique. Very impressive stuff. I mean, there is a reason this guy is the best endgame player of all time. All right, we're on to the 5th and final game of today. It is Ding Liren, the defending world champion, against Hans Niemann, the man who says he will be the world champion of chess in the future. But does Hans have what it takes to actually beat a world champion? Well, this is his chance. Let's see what happens in the game. Okay, in the game, Ding Liren opens 1d4, and we get a Catalan on the board after g3, d5, bishop g2. Now, Ding Liren is one of the biggest Catalan specialists in the world, right up there with Magnus Carlsen himself, so this game is going to be interesting. Now, from here, Hans Niemann, he plays mostly 2 different lines, bishop b7 and bishop b4. In the game, he goes bishop b7, and we get the standard line with castles for both sides, then d takes and queen c2 on the board. Now, from here, the main line starts with move a6, then white goes a4, black goes bishop d7, white takes bishop c6, and so on. There's a lot got a theory here. Instead of this, Hans Niemann is the first one to throw a bit of a surprise. He actually defends the pawn with the move b5. Now, this move b5, it's rare, but we have seen it before. For example, Jan Nepomucci played it in his World Championship final against Magnus Carlsen in 2021. Now, if you remember in that game, Magnus Carlsen played a surprise move, that is knight to e5, and the whole game after that was completely insane. That is not what we see today, though. Here, Ding Liren plays the most common move, and probably the strongest one, that is the move a4. Now, of course, White's idea is to try and break up this pawn structure so we can win the pawn on c4. Now, from here, Black plays bishop b7. This is the main idea of the variation. Black is actually sacrificing a pawn here. All right, let's see how it goes. White takes on b5. Black goes a6, sort of in the spirit of a Benko gambit. And now we get b take a6, knight takes a6, and queen takes c4. All right, this is the main idea. Both sides get exactly what they want in this game. So for White, he is up a clean pawn. He has 2 pawns on the queen side versus Black's 1. So White getting simple development, Catalan bishop, up a pawn, everything is great. However, Black also has his trumps. Here, Hans Niemann is going to get very fast development, especially considering counterplay against that queen on c4. And beyond that, he also has 0 weaknesses. He's going to break with move c5 at some point. The bishop on g2 is opposed by bishop b7. And overall, Black doesn't have too many complaints besides the lost pawn. Okay, from here, Hans Niemann, bishop d5, the best move, hitting the queen with the gain of tempo. Now, from here, the strongest move for Ding is queen d3, but instead of that, he goes queen to c3, a bit of a surprise. As you're going to see, White has just a bajillion squares he can move the queen to in this line. Now, from here, the strongest idea for Black is simply c5 right away, breaking on the queen side and getting more pieces into the game. However, instead of that, knight e4 on the board, another surprise. Now, once again, Ding Liren, he has a million different squares he could move his queen to, queen e3, queen c2, even queen d3. Instead of those, he plays a kind of unusual looking idea of queen e1 in this position. Again, so far, this is all theory. Both sides have so many plans. Let's keep going. Here, Hans Niemann finally gets the key break-in. That is the move c5. Now from here, all of his pieces are about to jump into the game. So White, bishop e3, defending d4. Now Hans, knight b4, jumping in with his knight. Of course, this move also opens up tension with the rooks on the a-file. White is going to have to trade. Rook takes, queen takes. Now Hans Niemann has a lot of pressure on this long diagonal with the queen and the bishop. Okay, from here, White, knight c3, but this invites just another set of trades. Black takes on c3, then he goes knight c2, forking both the queen and the bishop. Now the queen has to move. Hans takes on e3, and he takes on d4. C takes. So if you made it this far, all right, that is the end of the math simplifications. And again, here, both sides basically get what they wanted out of the opening. So the opening phase is mostly over. White is up a clean pawn, and Ding Liren is going to try and slowly improve his position and press with the extra pawn. Meanwhile, Black, on the other hand, is trying to argue that extra pawn doesn't really mean anything. I've got the bishop pair, I've got the control of the long diagonal, and Hans is trying to argue it's going to be too difficult for White to actually make progress here. So we have a clash of ideas. This is going to be very interesting to see what happens. All right, Hans, rook d8, maybe putting some pressure on d4 at some point. Not a bad idea, but Ding Liren, he's on top of it. He goes queen f4. The idea is he's clearing the e3 square for the pawn. He wants to go e3 and have those pawns all defending each other. And that is exactly what happens. Hans pressuring d4, but Ding Liren, e3. Now all of those pawns just beautifully defended. Ding is nothing to worry about besides that pressure on the long diagonal here. Okay, Hans, h6, getting a little breathing room for his king maybe, and Ding h4. This h4 is a very common idea in the Catalan, and it works especially well here. Ding is gaining space for his king, space in the king side, stopping g5 ideas, and he might even want to go h5 in the future. So good multi-purpose move from Ding. Now Hans, rook to c8. Now this move is kind of a big giveaway. So what is the rook doing on c8? Honestly, not a whole lot. So here, Hans Niemann is basically telling Ding, I don't really have an active plan, so I'm going to play a fake move. I'm going to pass to you, and now it's up to Ding to prove that he can improve his position. Because Hans, he is out of ideas. He is just praying for a draw. Okay, Ding, knight e1, offering a trade of the bishops. And that is what happens. Bishop takes, queen takes, now queen f3. Once again, Ding Liren wants to trade some pieces here, but Hans Niemann declines, queen c4. Now from here, Ding Liren just slowly improves the placement of his pieces, activating the rook, activating everything else. And here Hans Niemann plays maybe a weakening move, g6. Now we're going to see this g6 move maybe come to bite Hans Niemann in the ass later. So Ding Liren, king g2, improving his king, and then he follows up with the key break, h5. Okay, this is so important. Here, Hans Niemann, he has a choice. G takes h5 would be an absolute disaster. These pawns would be so weak on the king side. So of course, instead of that, he plays g5, but now we can see this pawn h6 might be a huge weakness in the future. Hint, hint, wink, wink. So as you can see by the eval bar, Ding Liren already up almost 2 pawns according to the computer, just slowly improving here. And Hans Niemann, it's almost like he can do nothing to stop Ding Liren's pressure. Okay, from here, Ding Liren improves, and Hans Niemann finally offers the trade of queens. Queens coming off the board, and rook b7 from Ding. Oh my goodness, the pressure in this position from Ding is just nuts. Now from here, Ding Liren spends about 15 moves just slowly improving his position. I don't want to cover these moves in too much detail, but you can see Ding just slowly centralizing here, putting on the pressure. And then finally in this position here, Ding Liren finally gets his big break. That is the move d5. So, of course, the idea is if Hans Niemann takes, Ding Liren's king moves into the board and the pressure just builds. All right, Hans Niemann, instead of taking, he tries to defend with the king. That way, if D takes e6, then F takes e6 back. All right, Ding, rook b6, trying to line up the rook with the king, increasing the pressure. And now in this position, it's time. D takes e6. And funnily enough, the placement of the king and the rook for black stop Hans Niemann from taking back with the pawn. If he goes F takes, then knight to d4, hitting the rook. And also hitting the pawn on e6 with the knight and the rook. Oh my goodness, that would be too much. So of course, he does not take here. Instead, rook c3, counterattacking against the e3 pawn. However, here, Ding Liren ignoring that. He takes on f7. He takes f7. Now rook takes, but king d5. Ding Liren continues the attack. Oh my goodness, king takes. Rook a6 from white. You may be wondering, wait a minute, isn't Ding Liren just giving up the pawn on the f3 square? Well, no, he's not, because of the tactical resource knight to e5, forking the king and the rook if it goes there. All right, Hans, rook d3, and now we have a shuffling of the pieces. Hans Niemann basically offering a draw if white's to go back to king e4. But Ding Liren, no, he rejects. King c4, he rages on with the attack. And now Ding Liren's next objective is to put pressure on that h6 pawn, and that is exactly what we see in this game. Ding Liren closing in, and finally here, taking that pawn on h6. Hans Niemann takes back on the f3 square, but that is just too little, too late. From here, Ding just slowly increases the pressure, pushes with h6, and Hans, the best he can do is throw some checks against the king, but it's not enough. King d5, rook b5 check, and here the winning move for white is king to e6, but Ding Liren, king e4. This turns out to be a big mistake, and according to the computer, it actually blows most of white's advantage. But in this position, Hans Niemann doesn't realize that. I gotta emphasize, Hans Niemann here, he has 1 minute and 30 seconds on the clock against Ding Liren's 1 minute. And despite that, and despite this being a theoretically drawn position, according to the computer, you can see over here, the computer showing almost equal. In this position, Hans Niemann resigns to Ding Liren. What the heck is Hans Niemann doing? Did I miss something here? Did I miss some moves in the game or something? I mean, I pulled this straight from the chess.com database. Unless this is wrong, Hans Niemann resigned in a drawn position. Hans, what are you doing? You're giving me a heart attack here. I'm trying to defend you in every video that I can, and then you go and just draw and give up in a position where you should have fought on. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. This looks like a losing position for black. But oh my goodness, Hans, why the heck would you not fight on here? Oh my goodness. All right, folks, that is it for today. Make sure to come back tomorrow. I'm going to be covering all of the latest games in this tournament, the FIDE World Rapid Championship. And I mean, the players in this tournament, Magnus Carlsen, Hans Niemann, Ding Liren, I mean, you name it, they are here. Except for maybe Hikaru. He's not in it, but everyone else, it seems like. So make sure you come back for my next video in this tournament, and I will see you in the next video.